Hi, this is Dr. Karen Wilson Starks, your host for the Voice of Leadership, the show for business executives and global corporations who appreciate a principled biblical lens on leadership, featuring the song Consuming Fire by gospel jazz saxophonist Ron McMillan. You are listening to our Resource Renewal Series featuring shows for times such as these. Welcome to the Voice of Leadership, and this is part 2 of our conversation with liberty and justice for all. If you missed part 1, please go back and listen to part 1. And today I'm continuing with my special guest, Dr. Marvin A. McMickle, who is a pastor. He is a professor, academic. He is an educator, author, community leader, and so much more. Last time we talked a lot about his history and background and leading the church and continuing to also do community service. And we talked a bit about what businesses can do today to be more effective at leading diversity, equity, and inclusion. And we're going to continue that conversation in this part 2 episode. So Dr. McMickle, thank you so much for joining me for part 2. I really appreciate you hanging in there and continuing our conversation.
Thank you for inviting me back. I enjoyed part 1. I'm looking forward to part 2.
Fantastic. So I'm going to start with this question about the current climate and what's going on right now. We know that there's a Me Too movement. There's a Black Lives Matter movement out there. What can business leaders learn from both of these movements?
They can learn that our society is far more diverse than they may have been assuming in terms of, again, their board of directors, their management team, the way in which they hire, the way in which they advertise, the way in which they divest. Most Americans have no idea what the 1790 Immigration Act is. The 1790 Immigration Act essentially said, with respect to immigration from Europe, the United States is a white nation. It's a white people's country. It's been that way for the last 200 plus years. Somebody has to help us understand that the world has changed since 1790. I don't see much help coming from the current White House on that issue. So business leaders must lead the way, not just in terms of their profits and their losses, but in terms of moving our whole society forward. And I hope they'll see what's happening in the street. It's just a call for inclusion.
Yeah, let's talk a little bit about that, because many people misunderstand what's happening in the street. They don't see the pain, they don't see the agony that may be behind these situations, and they don't recognize that some of these injustices have been going on for years and years and years, just not unveiled to the entire public, but certainly known in the African American communities. So how would you explain what's going on in the street so that business leaders can have more empathy about that response?
Well, let's take each one of these. The Me Too movement began essentially as a cry about the persistence of sexual aggression and sexual assault. Business leaders can be sure that the places where they are doing business are not safe havens for sexual abuse and sexual assault. What are your policies? What are your personnel policies that protect women from unwanted sexual advances? What are the signals that you are sending to your employees that any attempt to abuse your female employees will be dealt with in a very serious way? Do you have women in positions of authority? That's the best thing you can do to move in that direction. The same thing is true for Black Lives Matter. Does your company practice racism in its hiring? Does your company allow racism in the way in which it treats its customers? These two groups are simply saying to us, you've got a responsibility as much as the government does to be places where people who are women or ethnic minorities can feel safe, can feel wanted, can feel invited and can feel affirmed.
Okay, thank you for talking about it in that way, that when people are included and there's more of a partnership, you really do get different results. And I think for many people, they have been raising a voice for a long time, maybe haven't been heard, and in some cases, voices have been silenced. And so people have not been able to talk about the sexual abuse or whatever that they may have experienced with some senior leaders in the workplace. And so some of that's just starting to come out now.
Yeah.
So I hear you saying that organizations need to hear the message, hear what's behind the message, and there really are steps that can be taken to remedy some of the challenges that are going on.
Can I give you an example?
Yes.
I think that of the major businesses, and you are in yourself one of these arenas, which is the media, to the extent that media companies have female and ethnic minority anchors or program producers, they're going to get a different kind of programming than would be the case if it was an all-white male panel of anchors. So here in the last few days, a particular cable station, I won't name which one, had an African-American male host who put the spotlight on the number of African-American men who have been falsely imprisoned, spent 20 to 25 years in prison for a crime they did not commit, and have been released with 25 years of their life lost. I am persuaded that the average white television anchor would never have shed the same spotlight on that issue as that black male anchor did. That's just a small example of what happens when you get people in places of influence who can shine the light in places that the average white person would never even think to look.
Exactly. And therefore, they would continue to be unaware of what's actually going on, which would be certainly challenging. So let me dial in another piece of this. You and I both have a real respect and interest in Dr. Martin Luther King and his approach to what I would call civil disobedience and nonviolent social change. And I want you to talk a little bit about what you learned from Dr. Martin Luther King, because you had an opportunity to meet him personally, and how are his methods and approaches still relevant today?
Well, the first word that I think your audience needs to hear about Martin Luther King Jr. Isn't nonviolence. The first word is courage.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think I ever met a more courageous person, because he was putting himself forward on an issue in a location where every day was a dance with death. When you are talking about integrating public facilities and advocating for the right to vote in Alabama, Mississippi, Georgia in the 1950s and the 1960s, you are fundamentally calling for an upheaval of the social order. And that was at a time when civil rights leaders like Medgar Evers were being shot in the back. Yes. So before I say anything else about Dr. King, I just want to salute him, his wife, and that inner circle, John Lewis, Andrew Young, Ralph Abernathy, and others. Magnificent courage, because they walked out the front door facing death. And of course, we all know that in the end, that's exactly what happened to him. But he was committed to this nonviolent principle, not as a strategy, but as a lifestyle. And I think the world has now come to realize he has fundamentally altered the course of American life. And he did it without firing a shot.
Yeah. So what would you say to organizations today? Because we know that some organizations, even though they're standing up for a cause that's really important, they are standing up for maybe not in the same way of being committed, for example, to nonviolence, or not necessarily being committed to not committing crimes themselves. Whereas Dr. Martin Luther King was very specific about preparing his people, and he taught them how to march in a way that was nonviolent, how to respond to police brutality and abuse and other things that they might experience, so that they would not just respond in the moment and do the wrong thing. In other words, the training was involved.
Well, I've been in enough civil rights marches with him and because of him to know that The march was the last part. The march was part 4 of a process. The first process was to identify what is the issue that you are trying to achieve. So you're not just against something, you're for something. Employment practices, the end of housing discrimination, the right to vote. Okay, that's the first thing. The second thing is, have you tried to resolve this problem peacefully without a march? Have you gone to the appropriate committee? Have you gone to the appropriate company and tried to settle this? You know, what you want, can we get it peacefully? Third, if the answer is no, you got to fight for this, then your point comes into bear. Let's be trained on what a nonviolent demonstration looks like, and let's be prepared that when they curse you, when they throw something on you, as I've had thrown on me, when they hurl insults at you, how will you respond? For God's sakes, do not provoke, because all some folk want is to be provoked, to beat you to death. And then fourth, if you're going to go on the march, you've got to sign a waiver. You got to sign a form that commits you to nonviolence. Most folks marching today have done none of those things. And that's why things can get out of hand.
Yes, and we might end up finding ourselves in some worse positions inadvertently, even though the issues that are being raised and brought to bear need to be addressed, and they are important. So I guess I'm hearing you say, and I knew we've covered even on my program before, this 4-step approach that Dr. Martin Luther King took to how to resolve issues. We've definitely talked about that, especially during Martin Luther King weeks in different years. And I think that what I'm seeing is an opportunity for people to learn about this again, because I don't think the average person is aware of this approach.
Well, you know, I want your audience to remember how few people were really involved in this. You look at Martin Luther King Jr. 52 years later, and you get the impression that the whole world was on the Edmund Pettus Bridge, or the whole world was at the March on Washington, or the whole world agreed with him. In point of fact, Dr. King was reviled by a great many people in this country, and it took another 15 years for Ronald Reagan to begrudgingly agree to the Martin Luther King holiday. We need to be reintroduced, not to his biography, but to his methodology. Every time there is a burning of a police car or the looting of a place of business, we diminish him, because that's precisely what he never wanted. Why? Because the looting then becomes the story and not the knee on the neck, or the looting becomes the story and not the absence of a fair employment practice. We got to do better. We can't let a peaceful march end up every night with a burning building. That's just counterproductive.
Yes, and it definitely dilutes the message and takes the focus off of the real problem, for sure. So I really appreciate what you're saying about that. Now, if we turn our attention back to the business environment again, and you've said this earlier about this delicate balance that businesses have between, let's say, making a profit and also operating by some moral principles and by some integrity. And sometimes businesses are faced with decisions where they can make a lot of money doing something that's not the right thing. And I'd like for you to comment on that, and particularly at this time now, because not only are we in this pandemic of injustice, as we've been talking about, some businesses are downsizing and they're going through all kinds of difficulties financially. And so it's very important to think about how they're going to balance this profit and principle. So what would you like to say about that?
Well, let me quote the governor of New York State, Andrew Cuomo. He was sending a warning about this issue. He was saying, every time I hear the phrase downsizing, he said, why is it always that you want to downsize on the backs of the working poor, as opposed to maybe shedding some profit for the sake of keeping your workforce in place? It's always a trade-off between stockholders who want to maintain their level of income and your workforce, that you may decide, okay, in order to reward my stockholders, I'm going to reduce my overhead. I'll reduce the number of my employees. So the upper echelon who need the money the least are the ones who are protected, while the people who need the money the most, entry-level positions, minimum wage jobs, maybe living wage jobs, but certainly folk who are going to miss the next paycheck are the first ones to go. Cuomo had a wonderful quote. Why is it that whenever there is an economic problem, it is the poorest people who pay the highest price? That phrase haunts me. Why is it that every time the country goes through a crisis, people who are already poor end up being made poorer because we're determined to safeguard the rich?
Let me jump in on that and ask you a question about that as well, because suppose a company decided to forego some profit and actually retain more of their workforce, people who are living paycheck to paycheck and day to day, and who may be in that category of some of the poorer people. What would be the benefit to the organization? Just as we discussed before, the benefit of even having a diverse workforce, there's also a benefit to doing something like what we're talking about now. How would you describe that benefit to a company and an organization when they see the upside on the shareholder value, not necessarily on the workforce value or the participation of the workforce in, let's say, equitable pay and other matters?
Everybody who's got a job is not just a wage earner, they're a purchaser. They buy products. They go to the dry cleaners. They go to the restaurant. They go to the movie theater. They buy automobiles. They buy houses. To the extent that you impact a person's ability not just to earn a living, but to spend money in the marketplace, you're shooting yourself in the foot. Who's going to buy all the stuff that you're making? The people who are, on your board of directors, by and large, they're already millionaires. The folks who are your upper level management, okay, they're going to be all right. But the people who you count on to buy your goods and services, if they lose their job, you saved the bottom line, you think, but what you've saved in salary costs and benefits, you lose in terms of commodity sales because Ford stops having cars sold. AMC movie theaters stop seeing ticket purchases. Restaurants stop seeing folks coming in to take a takeout meal. It makes no sense if you think about the way in which the economy actually works. And so you don't want to hurt the folk who are supporting you, not just earning money, but spending it.
So it's the difference between thinking about the short-term objectives versus the long-term. And a lot of times I think many corporate leaders think of the long-term in terms of the shareholder value. Yeah. And you're saying there's really a market here of people who are buyers and who would actually make more purchases. And so if you disenfranchise that group, you are actually still harming yourself, which really speaks to the fact that it's an ecosystem and you really can't harm this one over here without at the same time ultimately harming yourself, even if you can't see it in the short term.
The more people you have in the workforce, the more folk you will have in the marketplace. They earn and they spend. By and large, poorer people do not invest. They can't afford to do it yet. What they earn, they spend. It goes right back into the economy. To fail to see that is, as you said, really short-sighted.
Exactly. So let me ask you now something maybe a little more personal about this. You are a leader, I know, who's been willing to take many stands multiple times and to participate in nonviolent social change initiatives, even at personal cost. So tell us about the time when you spent 3 days in jail with Dr. Ralph Abernathy. What did you learn from that experience? How did those 3 days impact your life? Yeah. Tell us about that.
3 days with him, 2 days in jail. Yeah, 3 days in total, 2 days in jail. I was in New York City. I was working with the SCLC program Operation Breadbasket. which was the division of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference that dealt with economic development. And the A&P food store was guilty of what we've been talking about. No upper level management in the food store, nobody on the board of directors for the A&P food chain, and not many store managers. So we started a boycott of A&P in order to get folks to not buy from them until they realized what is the power of Black purchasing. And if you lost Black purchasing power, what happens to your bottom line? So we went to their headquarters somewhere in Manhattan, might have been 34th Street, for a sit-in with the intention of being arrested for trespassing. Ralph Abernathy, who was then the president of SCLC because Dr. King had been killed 4 years earlier, came to get arrested with us to dramatize this issue. As it happened, we did get arrested at about 7 o'clock that night. New York City paddy wagons came and took us down to the downtown jail and threw us all in jail for a period of time. Don't you know, as luck would have it, I got thrown in jail with Ralph, David, Abernathy, and there we sat, just the two of us, to quote the song. I got a lesson, I got a history lesson on Martin King. I got a history lesson on Albany, Georgia, Birmingham, Alabama, all the battleground states, until we were finally released on what they call in the legal world our own recognizance, which means you don't have to post any bail. And in point of fact, they never pressed the issue. A&P did not want to take Ralph Abernathy to court because that would just make the matter worse. And so they did finally settle. And I don't know now who they hired, but Operation Breadbasket, nationally led by Jesse Jackson, agreed to a settlement. But it was the result of going to jail, picketing, running the risk. You don't know what jail is like till that door clangs behind you and you don't have the key. You're there till somebody comes to unlock the door.
And that really gets back to that word you used earlier about Dr. Martin Luther King, the courage that it takes to actually put yourself at risk, and you don't know what's really going to happen or what the outcome is going to be or how long you're going to be there.
Can I tell you a story about Dr. King?
Yes,
1960.
please.
He was arrested for a traffic violation that had taken place when he was, driving somewhere in Georgia. And they sent him to the worst work camp prison in Georgia, in chains, in the back of a police car with a German Shepherd police dog growling in his face. And they put him on the chain gang. Now, we all knew that the intent of that was he would accidentally fall down the stairs or mistakenly hang himself in his cell, until Robert Kennedy called Coretta Scott King because he'd heard about this. Now, this is during the campaign in 1960. Kennedy was losing that campaign at that point. Robert Kennedy called Coretta Scott King to ask, what can we do? She said, well, if you call the governor of Georgia and get my husband out of jail, that's what you could do. John Fitzgerald Kennedy called the governor of Georgia to get Martin Luther King Jr. released from that prison in Georgia. When Dr. King got out, he told that story to the national news media, and the polls shifted because all the Black people who had been Republicans because of Abraham Lincoln became Democrats because of one phone call that John Kennedy made to the governor of Georgia to get Dr. King out of jail. And so John Kennedy owes his election, not because, he was smart or anything, he was, but because he made one phone call that changed the course of American history.
That's a great example of being able to use your power and influence for whatever position you're in and to lend it to a cause that's actually important and that you could close your eyes about, not pay attention to. And we don't know what would have happened to Dr. King had he stayed there
We
and
don't.
whether he ever would have gotten out.
We know he was not going to come out of there alive.
That's what seems likely. Exactly. Yeah. And unfortunately, those same things are still happening today to many other people, as you said earlier, who are being imprisoned unlawfully and inappropriately and may serve 25 years or something may happen to them while they're in prison. They may not come out alive to tell about it, and they really were not criminals. They were innocent of whatever they were charged with. And I think people don't realize that these things are still happening today. It's not like, okay, this was back in Dr. Martin Luther King's time and we're no longer having that experience. That's not true.
Ahmaud Arbery was shot while jogging in the same state of Georgia. Breonna Taylor shot and killed in Louisville. George Floyd suffocated to death in Minnesota.
That's right. And they're not the only ones in long string of names that we could name of people who have been in similar situations. And so for those who might be the Robert Kennedys of the world, the JFKs of the world, there's still a place for them to intervene and to lend their voice. Because as Dr. Martin Luther King says, the decent people of society, when they are silent, it actually, I would say, put the nails in the coffin for people.
Yeah, and his famous phrase was, he is not nearly as concerned about the hateful words of the bad people as he is about the appalling silence of people who think they are good.
That's right.
But they lack courage.
That's
because
exactly
you
what
have to risk something to make that phone call.
That's right.
Yeah.
Completely. So now I know that you have a son, you have a daughter-in-law, you have granddaughters. What are your concerns about the world that they are facing right now? How are you preparing them? And how would you suggest parents prepare their children for the workplace of today and tomorrow?
I have a son who is 40 years old, who lives in New York City, who is terrified of the police because every encounter he's ever had with the police has not been because he approached them for help, because they approached him for pure harassment. One day he was walking down the street in Brooklyn. They live in Brooklyn, New York. And a police officer stopped him to say, "Could you please come inside the precinct? We'd like to ask you a question." He said, "Do what?" So we're looking for somebody, and you look like you might be the person that we're looking for. We just want to talk to you about it. He said, "Am I under arrest?" They said, "No." "Have you got a warrant for my arrest?" They said, "No." He said, "There's no way in the world I'm going to voluntarily go into a New York City police precinct for you to ask me about something because you're looking for somebody. Why does my son, who's done nothing wrong, have to be stopped on the streets of Brooklyn by a police officer who says, maybe you could possibly be the person we're looking for? Come into the precinct so we can." He would never have come out of there not arrested.
Or harmed in some other way.
I've told my son, listen, if you ever get stopped by the police, don't provoke. Don't make any sudden moves. Don't get irritated. Don't give in. Be respectful. But I'm sure he did not go in that precinct because we told him over and over again, if they don't have a warrant for your arrest, if they haven't stopped you for a crime, exercise your right to a fair trial and to not be falsely accused. That's a constitutional right. Now, for my granddaughters, who are both gorgeous, me too, I really am afraid for young women in this ultra masculine, patriarchal culture where women are for the taking. And I want to say to people, women are not commodities to be grabbed and exploited and then dispensed with when you're through with them. Raise your daughters to be women with integrity, but to learn how to say no and stand by that. And in the workplace, I say again, the most important thing employers can do is enforce whatever your policies are, or have policies against sexual exploitation and assault.
So you really are talking about empowering children today so that they know how to stand up for themselves and in a way that doesn't bring more harm to them at the
Yeah,
same time.
right,
Yeah.
yeah.
It's definitely a fine line you have to walk. I grew up in the era when I know about that as well. I mean,
Yeah.
certainly. Let me shift to a different set of questions. I want you to think about the worker out there, and maybe they're not the leader, as we've been talking about so far. What words of encouragement do you have for those people in the workplace who might feel voiceless or disenfranchised or discouraged? What might you say to them?
You know, the one thing that all of us have is a personal example. If you are a white person, particularly a white male, at a time when white men seem to be under the umbrella that all of them are racists and all of them are bigots and all of them are sexual assaulters, the one thing you can do to disprove that is to behave in a way that conflicts with the narrative. Treat your coworkers with respect. Treat people the way you yourself would like to be treated. Watch your language and your vocabulary. It's amazing how quickly a racial or sexual slur can fall from somebody's lips. Mahatma Gandhi used to use this phrase, be the change you want to see in the rest of the world. We all have a sense of personal responsibility. If you haven't got any authority except over yourself and your own vocabulary, exercise that authority.
Great. I love the call to action about doing what you can do, because you certainly can't live for somebody else.
Right.
You can only live your own life in that sense.
Right.
So now, before I ask you my final sort of question, I want to come to the place where I know you've written, as you said, 17 books. The 18th is on its way out. And you've told us in the episode 1 about one of those books. What is it that you're passionate about now, and where can readers find and purchase your books?
Yeah. Well, they're all on Amazon. So anybody that wants to just type in my name and Amazon.com, then they'll all show up. The picture of the cover will show up and everything, and you can order them that way. I've published with 3 different publishers. I won't mention all of those, but Amazon.com. My current passion really dovetails into this last discussion, because even though I spent my life in the church, I am so terribly displeased with the way in which the church, which is comprised largely of African American women, has denied them leadership roles in the church. I'm passionate about supporting women in ministry. I'm passionate about tearing down this male-only stronghold of deacons and preachers and church leaders. I was raised in the church where the pastor was a woman, so I've never had this bias in my own life. But I'm amazed that from one generation to the next, there are still people who want to cap women's aspirations for leadership in the society, in the government, in the public sphere, and even inside the church. My passion is liberty and justice for all, and that means men and women, Black, white, Asian, Hispanic, straight, gay. We've got to get past the 1790 Immigration Act, where this is a white person's country, and open the door so all of us can enjoy liberty and justice.
And I would imagine that, of course, when you have more inclusive voices, you're also gaining that talent that comes with those people, the special giftings of those individuals. And without that, you're missing something.
As a pastor, if I didn't have a female clergy with me, I can't tell you the number of issues raised by women I don't have a clue about. But I can say, listen, wait a minute. Let me bring in Reverend Fields, Reverend Cheney, Reverend Waite. These are the women I had on the stand. If you don't mind, would you tell them this story? They have my full confidence and my full support, but they could be much more help to you on this than I can. And they come, and I'll tell you, to have them around with their eyes and their ears and their experience made all the difference in my ministry.
Yeah, that's very similar to what you were saying about the business context. having people who look like the constituents because they're going to be able to relate and understand issues and know what to do next. Yeah,
right.
absolutely.
But they had the full support of whoever is in charge.
Exactly.
That's the
So
thing
they
that's
came with
crucial.
some authority.
Right.
Yes. So let me ask you my final question. And in this question, anything else you have not mentioned yet, feel free to say. You know that my audience is predominantly business executive leaders. What additional words of wisdom do you want to leave for that audience of business executives before we end today?
When I was a pastor in Cleveland, there was something called the Greater Cleveland Roundtable. It was a group of business leaders, local political leaders, educational leaders, and religious leaders, and nonprofit. And they met together on a regular basis, like once a month for a 7:30 a.m. breakfast. And each group was bringing both its concerns and its areas of power to bear. I found out that one call from me to a CEO about some civic issue was one thing. One call from another CEO to a CEO about supporting a poverty program or supporting increase in the minimum wage program made all the difference in the world. If you want to make your city a better city and you're a business leader at the highest level, take personal responsibility for relating to your peer group. Don't send the vice president for human relations to a meeting when what we need is the voice of the CEO or the board chair. Commit at the highest level to these values and watch what happens when your voice speaks about what you're committed to. And then you see the spillover effect, both in other companies and in your own company, because you've taken the stand first. If you want to be a leader, try to lead your peers.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. McMickle, for being my guest on these two different episodes of The Voice of Leadership. I really appreciate your presence and I appreciate the wisdom that you shared with us and also the historical pieces because you spent time personally with Dr. Martin Luther King, also with Dr. Ralph Abernathy. These are just important stories that we don't want to lose in the current day and in the current narrative. So thank you for coming to share that. And also because you've been in so many places of leadership in the community, in the church, also in the schoolhouse. That's a very broad perspective, and it's given us a chance to look at with liberty and justice for all from a broader context. So thank you again for being here with me.
Thank you for inviting me. I enjoyed it ever so much.
Fantastic. And to my audience out there, the Voice of Leadership, I thank you for being with us for these two episodes as well. And just remember, you can use your voice for something good, for something effective. You can lend your voice to those who may not have a voice. And as Dr. McMickle has said, try leading your own peers. That takes some courage and it leads to results. So thanks for being here, and I'll see you next time. As an executive business leader, you have many difficult decisions to make every single day. And it's important to think about, how do you develop your people? How do you launch and develop high performance teams? And how do you create a culture that wins every time? If you would like to take a look at your organization and to talk about the wisdom and guidance that would propel you to create a best place to work and also competitive advantage, then I invite you to apply for a consultation to work with me. Go to my website, www.transleadership.com, go to the services page, and under organizational consultation, you will see a tab that says Contact Us. That's where you request a consultation. So if you are an executive business leader in a medium to large size company, then I look forward to receiving your application and having a conversation with you. Have you ever wondered why you ended up in one career field as opposed to another? Well, that's exactly what we're going to talk about today in episode 2 of our 7-part series on lessons of leadership learned from Dr. Martin Luther King. So in episode 2, it's about recognizing and accepting the call to leadership. Last time, we talked about what Dr. King learned from his early examples and role models at home. If you haven't heard that yet, definitely go back and take a look at episode number 1. Again, today, we're focusing on his recognition and acceptance of the call to leadership. So if we think about Dr. King, early on, he knew that he had a very strong inner urge to serve humanity. In other words, it wasn't just about him. He had a bigger purpose, a bigger mission than just himself. And at an early age, he began to see what some of his gifts and talents are. So, for example, at 14 years old, he won his first oratory contest. So already he was on that pathway to being a powerful speaker. He was also an intellectual, a person who questioned the status quo, even in a church setting. He was very advanced for his age. He questioned things, and he went to Morehouse College at 15 years old. He was a person who, right from the beginning, sought some positive solutions to the racial ills that he saw around him. And even in college, he joined racial justice organizations to begin to do the work. He considered going into medicine. He considered being a lawyer. But then eventually, he finally decided that he could actually achieve the greatest good by going into the ministry and being a pastor, being a preacher. Later, when he and his wife were thinking about what they were going to do after he had finished his schooling, he had lots of offers and opportunities to work in the North where it would have been easier, where it would have been safer. And in the end, he decided to take a pastorate in Montgomery, Alabama, back in the South, because he realized that that would be the greater service opportunity. So he heard this very profound call to leadership. And one of the things he said about it was this. He says, there comes a time when time itself is ready for a change. And that time has come to Montgomery, and I had nothing to do with it. So he's really being summoned and called by a mission that he's not even leading, but he is answering. He is responding to it. And one way of thinking about it is to think about this. Each person is entering their time in history with certain gifts, talents, and strengths that are needed for such a time as this. So with those kind of gifts, there's a passion for leading in a particular arena. And Dr. Martin Luther King had that passion. So here's the problem that I see today. People are often doing jobs for the wrong reasons. You have people in the workplace who are not passionate about what they're doing. You have people who are not called to the specific things that they're doing. They don't have the gifts. They don't have the talents. They don't have the abilities. They're there for the money. They're there for the prestige. They're there to live out maybe a parent's dream. But they're not there for that greater reason and purpose beyond themselves. And that's one of the challenges that we have in today's workplace. And we can learn from Dr. Martin Luther King. One of the things that I've seen and that I've learned over the years is that those leaders who are passionate and are operating in concert with their gifts and talents actually render the best service to their organizations and get the mission done. We have, over the last so many years, been using some specialized tools to really help leaders assess what are those gifts and talents they have. Where do they fit in? So I invite you, give us a call, have a conversation. Have a conversation with me so I can help you really be dialed into your true passion and deliver what you were meant to deliver in the workplace. I've been a longtime proponent of continuous learning in organizations and also for leaders. So we are now at episode 3 of our 7-part series of leadership lessons from Dr. Martin Luther King. Last time, we talked about Dr. King recognizing and accepting the call to leadership. This time, we're really talking about his pursuing broad learning. And here's what I've discovered over the years. True transformation, breakthrough, and impact only comes through change that's actually spurred by new insights, new perspectives, new learning, and new experiences. So if we think about Dr. Martin Luther King, first there's the formal education. He got a BA in sociology in 1948 from Morehouse College. In 1951, he received a Bachelor of Divinity from Crozer Seminary in Chester, Pennsylvania. And then his doctorate in systematic theology, he obtained that from Boston University in 1955. Now, his learning was not ended with formal learning. Similar to my best clients, he was a continuous learner. One of the people that he really learned from initially was Henry David Thoreau and what he wrote in the book on civil disobedience. He also learned from Mahatma Gandhi, from Plato, Aristotle, Rousseau, all kinds of great thinkers, past and present. And from some of that reading, he didn't just take everything they said and accept it. There were some perspectives that remember we said in an earlier episode, he questioned and he challenged. He turned them around in his mind and he took the best of each perspective and made some interesting combinations. Some other people that he read Walter Rauschenbusch, and he came up with the idea that the soul, the body, and the spirit all together were important. There was both a spiritual and a material well-being that had to be addressed. He even read Karl Marx. He wanted to understand what was Karl Marx talking about. He ultimately rejected communism. And the reason he rejected it is because he determined that history was guided by spirit, not matter, and that man was not made for the state, but rather the state for man. He also observed that 19th century capitalism, it failed to see life as a social enterprise, but Marxism failed to see life as individual and personal. So what Dr. King was really great at, he would take disparate ideas and extract from them the value and create a synthesis from that value where he would say it's the individual and the collective together. That's really the truth of both, not one or the other. So he had that ability to maintain a both and perspective and to see opposites, to recognize flaws in extremism on one side or the other. Yet he still could extract truth from what he heard. So his greatest ability was being able to integrate that and come up with a deeper level of thought. Now, how does that relate to us today? Well, a challenge that I see in our society today is that we are embroiled in a lot of polarization of thought. We are living in a time of supposed tolerance when in fact there's a profound intolerance of difference in thought. There is a profound unwillingness to hear and explore radically different perspectives so that we end up finding that third alternative that's really beyond the extremes and also beyond the watering down of what I call the essentials. So, for example, in the United States, we have scenarios where there are numerous government shutdowns, whether that's in a Republican administration or a Democratic administration. We've had them in both. And this is a glaring example of this incivility, this unwillingness to listen deeply, to be able to find common ground, to be able to work together. It's easier to stay polarized. It's easier to stay stuck. But here's the difficulty. Persistent polarization hurts people. So, for example, in the United States, government workers are not getting paid. And when they're not getting paid, they can't pay their bills during these shutdowns. And what an outrageous inconsideration about the common good. And that's not really true leadership or what's needed for forward progress. So what does all of this have to do with you might be wondering? Well, I want you to consider your workplace and to really think about it. Think about what factors are polarizing and separating people in your workplace. Where do you see silos of silence? Where are there shutdowns in your organization? Maybe there are walls of separation between workers and management. Who are you shutting out and not listening to because you don't like what they're saying? Who are you not listening deeply to because you've already decided that what they have to say is not helpful or relevant? And by not listening deeply and by shutting out and raising up walls, how is the business and achieving the mission harmed? How are individuals harmed? So I ask you this: what can you do from your chair to increase deeper listening and the identification of the kind of integration that takes the best of all perspectives and moves forward? I was recently at a client's office, and this is exactly what we were talking about. This is exactly what we were doing. They have a number of silos in their organization. People not listening, people not communicating across the walls, and therefore mistakes happening, errors taking place, money wasted, time wasted, and people's talents and energy squandered. And so what we are doing and what we're talking about with them is how to turn that around. So if you're thinking about your own organization, you see some walls, you see some polarization, you see some of that incivility of the silos, let's have a talk. Let's have a conversation and help you to actually achieve the mission the way you want to achieve it. Join us for episode 4, The Necessity of Principled Leadership, next time. Thank you for listening to The Voice of Leadership with me, Dr. Karen Wilson Starks. I am also your concierge executive leadership advisor, but when you need to make tough business decisions, facilitate executive succession and transition, develop your executive team, lead change, create a positive and profitable culture, or leverage marketplace creative advantage, you can reach me at Dr. Karen KAREN at transleadership.com. Also go to my website, transleadership.com, for more leadership resources and insights. I want to give special thanks to Ron McMickle, gospel jazz saxophonist and national Billboard recording artist, also known as Mr. Sirius XM Jazz Watercolors, for allowing us to use his gifted music on our show. Thank you for joining me today, and I'll see you next time.